Good morning, everybody. For you folks watching YouTube, good morning. Welcome to Grace Christian Fellowship. Just a couple of announcements. End of the month, we have Richard's Memorial coming up, so make sure that we'll find a way. I meant to bring in my 3x5 cards today. Oh, I'm not on. Got to turn on the sound. There we go. Sound on. So, got to bring in some 3x5 cards so you can write up memories and just pray for Heather and family and everybody as we get ready to celebrate, have a celebration of life memorial for Richard at the end of the month. Family camp coming right around the corner. We need to have some coordination meetings on that one so that we can make sure that we know what's happening on that. But the 11th and 14th, save the date. Then notice down here we got some notes from Bill and Santa. Or some regular church chores that we could use some help on. And there you go. Anything else going on that we need to know about that we are unaware of? All righty.
Pray for Chet.
Pray for Chet, yes. Chet's eye is having difficulties again. And of course, it's not only difficult for the health, it's difficult for the pocketbook, so let's keep those folks in prayer. So, Father, we just pray for this morning, and first we just lift up our brother Chet, Lord, and just eye condition, pain, frustrations, everything that go with that. We just pray for healing, Lord, for him. And Father, we pray for those that are traveling today and those that couldn't be here physically. Just bless them and be with them. And Lord, now guide us in your word as we worship you in the word, Lord. And Father, I just pray that with this morning's subject that we would just have open hearts to allow you to challenge thoughts and thinking there. And to allow us to see the scope of your plan. We just ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So, we are finished with Luke, and now we're jumping into Daniel chapter 7. Some of the folks were able to attend the Tuesday night Bible study, so they're privy to some stuff. But we're going to jump into that and at that spot. So in a moment I'll do some Daniel review to hit that a little bit. But this morning you'll notice that I call the lesson Human Government. Mainly because as we look at this chapter, we're going to see how God thinks about things. When I was thinking about this, one of the things that when any of us who've gone to school or studied, one of the big studies that are out there is called anthropology, the study of man. Sometimes it's sociology, studying the social inner workings of everything. And mostly when you're in school, that's taught from a secular point of view. And so, of course, when they do historical anthropology, everybody's always studying and coming up with the idea of how mankind developed God, if you will. That's the secular worldview. In the Christian worldview, in the biblical worldview, we need to understand that we humans did not invent God to explain things. God made us, and then he began to explain things to us. Right out the gate, in the garden. He was there in the beginning. Of course, if you're familiar with the story of Genesis, you understand that we humans decided at the suggestion of another that we did not need God's knowledge to do things when we could grab it ourselves. When we could go get it for ourselves, by ourselves, through ourselves, and under our own power. So ever since then, ever since that moment, we human beings have been trying to solve the world's or humanity's problems without God. We do it at all levels. We do it individually, we do it at family levels, we do it group levels, city levels, and beyond to try to solve these problems. And of course, one of the many elements of this condition, because that's what it is, it's a sinful condition, a falling short condition, is a necessary mechanism that we call government. We have to understand all the time that human government is an exertion of power. And once again, at any level, it's an exertion of power. Again, as individuals, how we govern our own selves is still governing. We're putting a limit on ourselves. We have to do this. I've quoted this before, but one of our American founding fathers, James Madison, said we wouldn't need government if men were angels. So there it is. We need this governance. We need something to limit us, something to hold us back from the worst that we could be. That's the case. So we have these governments, and at whatever type they work for, sometimes for ill, sometimes for good. And even some of the worst ones, some great things happen. What does God think about our grand solutions to governance? What does he think about that? Well, Daniel chapter 7 gives us a very unflattering picture of what he thinks about these things. Before we hit that, though, I do want to just go over that basic review of Daniel. Get us up to speed. Give us some context of everything. Many of us are very familiar with Daniel chapters 1 through 6. It has some of the best stories of the Bible in it. Some great, momentous, consequential, both in a big picture, but very personal too. Very personal events in those first 6 chapters. We're introduced to Daniel of Judea. This young prince, noble of Judea, who was captured and brought to Babylon. Captured by Nebuchadnezzar. And then he's pressed into government service. Because somehow they looked at him and they thought, okay, you're not too bad of a guy. You kind of look handsome. King Nebuchadnezzar doesn't want ugly folks in his court. He's like, you fit the bill. We're gonna teach you and raise you up and have you be part of government service. And that's what he did. Got their education, 3-year education, and eventually he served before the king. So when we looked at Daniel's life, we found that Daniel, unlike being a guy that's like, okay, I'll get in there and then I'll foment rebellion and such, surreptitiously be behind the scenes. I'll pretend to serve Nebuchadnezzar well, but then when behind his back, I'm going to try to keep Israel going. I'm going to try to do this and that. That was not the case. Daniel did everything he could to serve Nebuchadnezzar well. And that's exactly what he did. And he and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they themselves were just really good servants. They served the government, did their job well, which is inspirational. And they used their education faithfully. And then Daniel, as we find out through those chapters, he not only served Babylon, but down the line, the Babylon was taken over by Medo-Persia, and they picked him. Even though he was like almost 80-something years old at the time. They said, no, we still want that guy to be part of our service, to help out. And of course, doing this all the time, Daniel and his friends were constantly dealing with attacks, especially jealousy. There was folks that were jealous of what he was doing. Some suggest, like Pastor David Jeremiah, he suggests that fellow Israelites who were just sick and tired of God and were trying to do their own thing would be jealous of Daniel. But all the time, he was doing that. Doing well. God used Daniel to influence others. He was a cultural influence. He and his friends, again, Rakshak and Benny. I love calling them that. Ever since I've seen that in VeggieTales, I just love calling them that because it's just so poetic. But it's just, they had to make stands right out the gate. Right out the gate, they said, hey, you need to do and eat and be all the things that the king wants you to do. And they're like, no, we can't do that. And they made a stand. Down the line, his three friends, they had to make a stand when they made a giant statue. And it says, got to bow down to the statue. With all the instruments, when the music's playing, you gotta dance the way we want you to dance. And they said, no. Daniel, of course, we see in his story, where when he was serving as an 80-year-old man, the other folks were jealous of him again. And they said, if you don't stop doing what you're doing, we're going to make sure that you pay the price. We're going to feed you to the lions. And all of these things happened. They didn't eat the king's food at the possible price of their lives. But God blessed them. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they said, no, we're not going to bow the knee at the possible price of their lives. And God preserved them. Daniel said, hey, this may cost me my life, but I'm going to make a stand. And we see this even today. I fear for Western culture when I see examples like I just saw just the other day, again, a pastor teaching in open air preaching, just teaching from Genesis. And he gets arrested in England for hate speech because the Bible says one thing about marriage that the world doesn't like to hear. That's right, it's between a man and a woman. That's marriage. That's God's plan. And it's just straight out of the Bible. But see, that's the way the world, when the world hears God's message, often they don't hear life-freeing, heart-healing, soul-releasing truth. What they hear is, they hear something that's keeping them down. And they call it hate. But Daniel and his friends in those first 6 chapters served faithfully. Even what's most amazing is there's a time when Daniel really could have took over. You realize that? Daniel, in his position, could have ran the country and took over. And that was the time where God disciplined Nebuchadnezzar. God was using Daniel and his friends to communicate to a world leader about his existence, about who he was. So much so that he drove him crazy and made him eat grass and hang out in the palace garden for 7 years, running around in the bushes, being crazy. That was Daniel's moment. That was Daniel's moment. He could have chose that moment. He could have said, oh, yeah, okay, we got him right where we want him. Let's move in all my policies. Let's make all this stuff happen. Let's make our religious circles good. He could have done all that. But he didn't. He honored Nebuchadnezzar. And in the end, when Nebuchadnezzar said that came to his mind, he knew who God was. And what's even better is he saw the faithfulness of this man who had been stolen from his home, brutalized, made so he could never have a family, dealing with all this jealous politicizing and all this stuff, stayed with him. And I'm sure that impacted Nebuchadnezzar's heart just the same. So, now we come to Daniel chapter 7. This chapter actually takes place before chapter 6, chronologically. So in Daniel, when you look at it, Daniel chapters 1 through 6 just gives the general overall events, but then Daniel in 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 backtracks with some visions that he had, things that were going on. And so that's why in Daniel 7:1, when he starts talking about his vision, he says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. And then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. So here he's with King Belshazzar. And if you're familiar with Daniel chapter 5, you find out that Belshazzar was the one there where he was having a party, decided to bring God's utensils from the temple in and have a party. But then God interrupted the party with the handwriting on the wall, said, hey, your days are numbered, and this is it. Scaring him to death. But that night, the Medo-Persian army, who was camped outside, they knew that they were out there, made a way in. They took over the kingdom. But this was in his first year. So he had 2 more years before that event would happen. And he has this vision. Dream so vivid, so clear, that Daniel, by the power of the Spirit, was able to write it down in its entirety. I never had visions like that. I wouldn't know. It seems like I'm 10 minutes after awake. It's like, what did I dream? I have no idea. Unless it, scared me to death or something like that, some of those, or just so amused me that at night it's like, oh, man, that was crazy. Then I might remember a snippet of it, but he remembers everything clearly. And mind you, again, this is Daniel's first personal prophetic vision himself. All the other stuff was Nebuchadnezzar's dreams that he is dealing with. This is Daniel himself is now having this dream. So he intros into this dream in Daniel 7:2, and Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. So Daniel would already know, these are idiomatic expressions. The 4 winds of heaven, that's just like wind from everywhere. That's what it meant. Wind from everywhere. And from every direction. And then it's stirring up the great sea. Now for them in the Bible, the way the prophetic things and the way Israel was never fond of the ocean. Now there's always exceptions. There was probably folks that were like sailing and fishing, but they did not really care. They were not an ocean-going people. They kind of stayed away from that. They were like, yeah, that's fearful place. Don't want to go there. So the oceans in their mind would conjure up negative feelings. In general. Stereotypically. And so here he is, he's seeing this, and so the great sea, what is all that about? I don't know. Just a second, we'll find out. Because in Daniel 7:3 he says, and 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. So it goes from a little bit nerve-wracking, a little bit scary. It's like, what's up with this? The ocean, I'm not too keen on the ocean. Whoa, something's coming out of this ocean. Something's coming out of that. What are these? What's happening? Who would this be and why would that be? Well, we find out later. Daniel asked some questions about this, and we're going to come down to it later. But I like the prelude of it, and we've talked about this before. The interpretation is revealed in Daniel 7:17. He says, these 4 great beasts are 4 kings who shall arise out of the earth. So Daniel's given an interpretation. And we're going to investigate that a little bit further down the line here. But he's told what this is about. Why he would look at this. And so he would understand it idiomatically to some of their slang and what they would look at. But he's told directly down there. And we're going to come back to this because of what he's told and what he goes at. But these 4 great beasts, says that it comes to their 4 kings, and they shall arise out of the earth. So that means the sea is the peoples of the earth. It's coming out of this area, out of the sea, out of the things that they're scared of, or they don't really care for. So, what was this vision about? Vision, first we're going to take it to the first three. Now, he talks about them as beasts. I just got to do this. Because when we talked about this at the Tuesday night Bible study, we mentioned that when Nebuchadnezzar sees the multiple kingdoms of the earth, he sees it in this glorious image made of different metals. Very majestic. Even if it's got mixed metals, they had gold, silver, bronze, iron, and iron mixed with clay down at the very bottom of its feet. This was his vision he saw, and he made it clear that these were the kingdoms of the earth that were going to be coming, and he was part of it. He was made to understood that he was the head of gold. I encourage you to go back and review that chapter. It's in chapter 2 of Daniel. But it's pretty straightforward. It's like, this is who we are. And so Nebuchadnezzar, in his mind, sees things that way. But Daniel, it's revealed in a completely different way. They're revealed like beasts. Not shiny, glorious, majestic things, but beasts. See, as I was looking at this, I think God is giving his assessment of the great Middle Eastern and Macedonian empires. Going on. This is his assessment at that time, because that's who they were. Egypt was there, but they're not really mentioned. And of course, there's other world empires of the world that are there. We know that the Chinese had their own empire thing going on over there where they were. There's other big people groups. But God is using these folks, particularly because of the regional influence and their influence throughout time. Because they have influenced us even today. We are direct products of the influence of these beasts, if you will. Humanity, when we view these governments, especially secular humanity is constantly, that's why they have all these studies all the time. It's like how to make things, how to govern people who are people. I mean, we have a joke around it in here. It's just like when Sunday morning starts, we're just like, okay, everybody's kind of trying to come back, and everybody says, I'm trying to herd cats. And really, that is the story of government. That is the story of government. It is humanity's way of trying to herd cats all around. And when we view governments in the different ways that we do it, it's flattering because we think of how wise and intelligent we all are coming up with ways to do it. I see some of the skeptical looks because when we really look at it, we know it's just like, what are you doing? Why did you do that? And that's, of course, that's the study of history. We always look at different governments and we look at why were they making those decisions? Why did they handle things this way? Why did they decide to make this law or cancel that law or do that or do this? That's the study of it. Because what we're doing is we're studying people, we're studying fallen humanity trying to manage and rule over fallen humanity. That's the truth of things. And in some sense, remember, we're the image bearers of God. That means elements of who God is within us. And a part of that is the creativeness and the pragmatic way that we do things. We find ways that work. That's what we do. We all do it. We all find something that works. Either practically for some job, or we'll be pragmatic about our own selves. We'll find something that will work. We'll find someone who will work. That's what we do. That's how we're wired. And the unfortunate thing is we're fallen. Fallen people trying to do these things. So even the very best that we could ever do the very best that we could ever do, will still be imperfect. And if anybody studied history, you know that the very best that we can ever do always gets twisted, always gets bent, because fallen people are involved. So we come to this first assessment that Daniel would have been very familiar with, and that was Babylon, represented by a lion. Just a note as we go into this, is we find out later, after God shows him some great throne room scenes, what's happening with God being in charge, that Daniel doesn't even ask about these first three beasts. He's not concerned with them. He's like, I want to know about number 4. So in that case, when we go through these, I'm going to touch on these guys a little bit. I'm going to talk about the significance that I feel as far as what their influence has been for the world. But really, we're going to move past them fairly quickly. Because even Daniel recognized, it's like, that's nice, but I really want to know what's going on with that one. Because that one scares the pants off me. So, first, taking a look at this lion, and it's just like it says, verse 4, it says the first beast that was there was like a lion, had eagle's wings. Very basic description of the Babylonian Empire. Daniel's given his work, or given God's view of his work on Nebuchadnezzar's life within this verse. Because it says it had wings, were plucked off, and it was lifted up off the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. The mind of a man was given to it. Now, when we were at Tuesday Night Bible Study, we were talking about this. Because this is what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, because he became a God-fearing man at the very end of his life, he became less like a beast. We've talked about this before. I'll repeat it again. Tuesday Night Bible Study, folks, you've heard this, but I'm going to repeat it. The more mankind goes away from God, the less human we become. The more towards God we go, the more of a human, as He's created us, we become. When we go away from God, we become like the animals. We behave like animals. It's like when the parent walks in the room, what are you guys doing in here? You guys all acting like a bunch of animals. And because that's the assessment. When we get out of control, when we become ungodly, we become bestial. We go to our base desires, and we see it. We see it in society. All around us, everybody's just living for their base desires. Not for higher desires of godliness and holiness. Those are the higher things. Now, with each one of these guys, they're just basic description, that's who it is. I want to talk about their government here, just real quick, because it has influenced us. For this government, you're like, well, this is Nebuchadnezzar. He was aristocracy. That's what he was doing. He was a king. But there was something different about Nebuchadnezzar that was a setup for a change in culture. One of the things that Nebuchadnezzar did is he took all these guys captive. He would take captives from every country he would take, bring them in, educate them, and bring his culture, but it was bringing in a mix of cultures. Very different than what was happening before that. So in other words, that was setting a stage for something. That was setting a stage for how people were going to interact with a government. So that's part of where we do it nowadays. And we're still in transition, but that's part of an influence. Even for America and around the world. The looking at cultures. Of course, nowadays, we're being challenged. Some are trying to say, oh, how dare you appropriate somebody else's culture. Which, without too much ado, is just garbage thinking. Garbage thinking because we're always appropriating everybody's culture. That's why we talk about friends. The friends you pick is the culture you're going to appropriate on an individual level. If you pick good friends, you're going to appropriate their culture, and vice versa. And then it just goes and gets bigger and bigger. So this is always happening, always been happening, always will happen. So to sit there and say, dare you appropriate my culture, is just silliness and foolishness. So that's my comment for the day on that.
I like tacos.
Yes. The next culture was the Medo-Persian culture, represented by a bear. Daniel 7:5. It says, behold, another beast, a second one, like a bear. It was raised up on one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, arise, devour much flesh. So this was talking about the Medo-Persian king. Talked about this bear. We had a good discussion on this during the Tuesday night Bible study. It rises up on one side. And we're going to note this down the line because in chapter 8 this comes up again. But the Medo-Persian was a 2-people group kingdom. The Medes and the Persians had combined forces, and so when they got up on one side, it's because one side was stronger than the other. In this case, at this particular time, it was the Medes. And that's why it's called the kingdom of the Medo-Persians. If you go to the book of Esther, it's called the king, the Persians and the Medes, because the tables had turned at who was more powerful than the other. At that time, for Esther, Ahasuerus was a Persian, so had the power base at the time. So this was going on. It talks about that he has 3 ribs. We're not given too much commentary on this to understand, well, why is this anything. Some suggest it talks about his hunger, which is true. It's going after things. It wanted to be bigger, wanted to be greater all the time, which is totally the fact. Is what had happened down the line. Is in the battles. You think of the battle of the Thermopylae in Greece and everything that was going on there, the Peloponnesian fields. That was all Medo-Persia trying to conquer Greece and moving forward into the world. That's what they wanted to do. But some also suggest there are 3 conquests. It could have been Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt, which they did conquer. Maybe had them in the mouth, but we don't know. Thing is, though, sometimes when we look in the Bible, what we try to figure out, like what's important, we wouldn't know. We just won't know, and that's okay. But the readers would know. The original readers, Daniel would know, and those guys would know directly what's going on. We know what that's about. In that culture, he would know right away. We'll find out when we get to heaven and we say, hey, Daniel, what was that all about anyway? Oh, the bear just like ribs. That's the whole deal. Get some big bad ribs there. That's what it's all about. Now, the governmental influence of the Medo-Persians, again, it was an aristocracy. They had kings. In this case, there were 2 different kings running the show, and Darius was there, and Cyrus. Cyrus was the Persian king. Darius was the Mede general. But now, on a grand scale, they were having a mix of 2 different cultures coming together. 2 cultures working together, 2 powerful cultures working together. This was unheard of. That's changing things. That's changing the way they had to do government, how they had to think about how they interact together. And of course, in this cultural mix, they did something which became problematic for King Darius and Daniel, is that they began to suggest laws that would curb the power of what a king could do and not do. That's huge. That's huge. And for us in our culture, a lot of times we think of the Magna Carta. Great event in England where the barons stood up and said, hey, king, you're running the show, but we're the ones paying the bills. And we want to have a say. So that's always been a major event in our culture. The Magna Carta there is where the lower folks began to have a say. But here, way ahead of that time, 1,000 years or better ahead of that time, you begin to see that in this culture and how it influenced them. Because then that leads us to the next culture, and that would have been Greece. Greece is represented by a leopard in Daniel 7:6. He says, after this I looked, and then behold another, like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on his back, and a beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. So here we go. Now this is, of course, talking about Alexander, and then after that, his 4 generals that took over. So it's a combined thought. Now, Daniel chapter 8 is going to describe this a little bit more in detail, because he has another vision of it specifically about Alexander and what he's going to do. But in this case, the leopard, whenever we think of the king of the cats, of course we automatically think of lions and maybe a tiger. But when it comes to cats that are just downright mean and are some of the best hunters in the world, it's the leopard. The leopard is fast, very fast, compared to a tiger and a lion. Not as fast as a cheetah, but they are quick, very deadly. And this leopard is even quicker because it's got bird wings, so it can even go quicker, which is emblematic of what we're going to find out about Alexander. Alexander, for him, conquered what he thought was the known world in 10 years. Unheard of at the time. Unheard of ability. Because he did it being outnumbered in every battle. Every battle he was outnumbered all the time. And it got worse down the line. Because he lost guys. His army didn't increase, but they were still winning. That's how good of a military commander he was. Very quick, all-encompassing, but he did that in 10 years, and he died 1 year later. Legend has it that when he got to where he was in India and he felt like there was no other world, he was bummed because there was nowhere else to go, no place else to conquer. So he paved the way. But the thing is, though, is he started one thing. He went into where all these other cultures were and what was going on there. Because we have to realize that in Greece, there was multiple city-states going on. But this all began to change things, even in Greece. Greece brought this whole cultural change into the whole area. The legacy of those 4 generals that survived, because one took over Greece, the other one northern Turkey, in that area, one in the middle of Middle East, and then another one in Egypt. We'll get to that in greater detail. But these guys, you realize what they did. What they did, they brought in, they took out all these other competing cultures, but encountered them. Got information from them. We got mathematical information from these other guys. We got logic information. All sorts of astronomy information. It all came from that Middle Eastern culture that Greece now had this knowledge of. Setting up military tactics and methods all started from there. Which changed our culture. The way they did things. It prepared the whole Mediterranean area for a unifying language, which we encounter in the New Testament. That was all part of that cultural change and shift. But that unifying language, you know what that does? We encountered that at the Tower of Babel. Where God's like, look at these guys. They all know how to talk together. They all communicate. They all work together, but they're still all fallen. And they all want to do something against me, even here. So he had to change up all the languages. But when mankind all starts to speak the same language, it's amazing what we can do, and it's amazing how we can fall. That's the thing. And they talk about that. There's a great book out there called The Earth is Flat, meaning how the communications nowadays, because of the internet and everything else, that all around the world now. Some of us, we get the service calls and we talk to somebody who has an accent that says, "Hi, my name is Steve," and we know Steve is not American at all. But we get a hold of these guys because of communication. We're all communicating. This is all what's happening. That's what's changing our culture for good and bad. Now, this government that they had, of course, they had an aristocracy again still. They still had kings. In this case, the generals all became kings in their own areas. But they added another element. They added the element of democracy, where they began to say, well, you know what? The king can't run everything, but the people want to have a say who's running the show locally. Who's going to do that? And so, well, how do we do that? Why don't we pick them? How do we pick them? Let's do it with a vote. And that began the idea, the experiment of democracy in government. Changing things up. Influencing us. Now we come to the fourth beast. Rome, the beast. This fourth beast is given the most attention in this chapter. It's given the most attention. Mainly because, as we find out down the line, Daniel asks specifically about it. I want to know about this beast right here. So this morning, as I'm doing this, I'm only going to be able to give brief attention, because we're going to give more attention down the line. But it gives Daniel this picture of this beast, which for Daniel, of course, is a prelude to history of the Roman Empire and what they were going to do. But there's significance within it because it gives us a prelude to something of history that is still future for us. And that, of course, is the rise of the Antichrist, or the beast, within this. So he has this vision. Daniel chapter 7, verse 7 says, "After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful, exceedingly strong." So Daniel had been the victim of defeat. He was not a little baby when Jerusalem and Judea was conquered. He was a young man. He got to see it. You know, it glosses over it pretty quickly, but that was death, that was starvation, that was warfare that he experienced. He understood it. So he was not a stranger to danger. He understood that this, whatever was going on here, this was scary than anything that he'd ever faced before. This was unnerving. And in fact, when we get to the very end of the chapter, it says that the visions changed the color of him. He paled, and he was nervous about this and anxious about what he saw. That's how big it was. Terrifying and dreadful, exceedingly strong. And it says in verse 7 still, it says, "And it had great iron teeth, and devoured and broke in pieces, and stamped what was left with its feet." Now, of course, the iron teeth is really familiar, for those of you with the statue we were just talking about just a second ago. The statue, it had iron feet that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed about, Daniel 2:30 and 33. So there it says a little bit of the beast. We're going to talk about this for a second on my little overheads here. Here we have what looks like a triceratops, but in this case it would be like a decaceratops because it has 10 horns all over it. Keep going.
Sorry.
Yeah. But this beast, here's all sorts of different pictures of what artists' renderings have put it at, because it's unidentifiable. Daniel didn't have anything to compare it to. It didn't look like anything he'd ever seen before. And in truth, the Roman Empire was like nothing nobody had ever seen before. That's why it's so fascinating to study it. To study it was one of the longest running empires of the world. And we still have the shadows of the Roman empires all around us every day. And so, but it was like he couldn't understand it. And so there it is. If you see artist rendering, they're all creepy, they're all scary, and as they should be. There it is. And then go to the next slide.
The next picture slide?
This is the next slide. So it devoured and broke to pieces, stamped what was left with his feet. Go to the next one. So here, that statue again. It says the statue's legs of iron, its feet partly of iron, partly of clay. So that's representative. Everybody agrees that that's talking about the Roman Empire. Had these iron teeth, of course, unlike just regular teeth, it could just clomp. It was vicious. It was vicious in doing what it was doing. The initial Roman Empire didn't know how to quit. That was one of their staples. If you beat them, that was not the end of the story. They would just come back again. That's what they would do. It didn't stop until Emperor Hadrian got tired of fighting Scottish people, which I'm very proud of. He was the only time where he said, that's it. We're not going to beat these guys. Let's just build a wall and keep the fence and make them stay on that side of the fence. But when Hadrian made that decision around the 200 AD mark, that was essentially the end of what the Roman Empire was. Because they stopped doing what they did, which was crunching, stamping with feet. Because when you got iron legs, you want to stamp something, it's good to go. They were equipped to rip apart and stamp down, and which they did with proficiency. But then Daniel again says this in the last part of it, where he said this beast was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. So this is part of what begins to catch Daniel's attention, because Daniel understood government. And even in those days, horns were used as a symbol of somebody being a ruler. So the Roman government in its own right was kind of interesting. That's why, again, it's so interesting to study the Roman government, because they had 3 different types of government. They started out with kings. That only lasted for 4 kings. And they said, we're done with kings. We're going to have a republic now. They immediately took their cue from Greece and what they had learned from Greece and the others, and they said, that's it, we're going to have an elected Senate. We're going to elect a Senate to run the show. There'll be no kings. There'll be one guy that's the head of the council kind of wrestling everybody together. But that's it. Unless an emergency comes, then we'll elect a dictator for 6 months. That's what they would do. They would have a 6-month dictator. And if somebody decided to stay around longer, oh, bad news. Because there was one guy that tried it. So he's a dictator, he had his army. It's like, I'm going to be the dictator for life. And this was early on, and they had none of it. And they got him, and they took him out. They're like, no. Nay, this is what's going to happen. And they deposed him and made a spectacle of it that says, no, this is not the way we're going. And it worked. All the way up to Julius Caesar. So it worked for several hundred years. All the way up to Julius Caesar. And then Julius Caesar was the next one that, in the chaos of everything, because, again, Rome was filled with people. And people doing people things. And it just became a mess. And thus, Julius said, hey, I can run the show. And in fact, he brought his army in, and that's where they had this place called the Rubicon River. And when you cross over it, if you crossed over, you had to leave your army on the other side. That was the rules of the road. So, that day, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, brought his army, and he says, I am going to become in charge of this mess. And he did, until he was assassinated. And everybody says, we got to get rid of him. He's being a dictator for life. Stab, kill, get rid of Julius Caesar. Within a couple of years, what did they do? Hey, in order to get this whole mess, we need a dictator for life. Who are it going to be? It's going to be I can't remember his name now. It escapes me. I want to say it wasn't Augustus Caesar. It might have been. But there it is. Like, they went right there. Even though they just killed Julius Caesar for the same thing. But that's where they went. And then for the next couple hundred years down the line, they had dictators. Caesars. The reign of the Caesars. And then it just became, because they still had to run things, it became a bureaucratic mess. And all it became, because see, that's the thing about government. Everybody, we have certain folks, I'm one of them, that goes for a limited government. Because I know something about government, and many other people do too. Government is an animal that ever wants to be fed. And always wants to grow. That's just what it does. That's kind of God's comment here. It just gets bigger and more vicious. That's how it operates. Sad but true. So, for their influences, like I said, has influenced us even today. Because of all of those different governments we've been allowed to study, we were able to look back at a culture and understand what they did. Now, nowadays, as America, we describe ourselves as a Christian nation many times. It's kind of going away. But even as a Christian nation, it was a Christian influence, but we were also influenced by these other models. God bless them. I love that our founding fathers were religious people. Many of them were. Some were not. But many of them were. And they were influenced by Christian values. But they were also influenced by Roman values. They were also influenced by Greek values. They were influenced by those Middle Eastern values and others. All these other values are all part of the mix. We've got to appreciate that. So, that government is now where we're at. And then, so because of his governmental training, Daniel focuses in on something. Because he's used to rulers. He's had to deal with multiple rulers. And so he understands horns right away. It's like, go, horns. I got to pay attention. I want to know what's going on with this. And so Daniel's attention drawn, verse 8 of chapter 7, said, I thought about the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. So here, this caught Daniel's attention. He's like, what's going on here? This is different. This is weird. Because it's like it's a little horn. He recognized that. So today, I'm going to leave it at that. Because we're going to come back at this. Because Daniel gets a whole big explanation. But many of us already know, in this moment, that's the introduction of the Antichrist. This replacement of the Messiah, if you will. So this morning we're going to do communion. And I thought, what an interesting Sunday to do communion on. What a weird, interesting segue. And as I thought about that, as we prepare for communion, I want us to relish this thought, which Daniel is given this thought to in a different form. Because Daniel sees this, and then God switches visions up right within midstream to show him something else. And it's something you and I need to remember. And this is how we remember it. We remember it every year. In Isaiah chapter 9, he says, but there will be no gloom for her who is in anguish, Israel, and humanity. In the former time, and he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time, he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them a light has shone. You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you, Father, in the joy at the harvest. And they are glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. For every boot the tramping warrior in battle tumult, and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. For to us, a child is born. To us, a son is given. His name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts make it happen. I want us to remember that. Jesus said to do this in remembrance of him. And I want to remember he's going to be in charge someday. He's going to run the show. So worship team, I'll invite you up. Pass up the envelope. So on that night, almost 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me. And there's so much to remember. So much to remember. In this world that tries to tell us God ain't ever going to come back, it's all going to just stay the same as it ever was. We're told to remember that he will be back. He's as good as his word. Just that night he said, this bread I'm giving you, we break it up. This bread, this is my body that's going to be broken for you. Take and eat and remember. Remember what he's done. Then the King of Kings and Lord of Lords took a cup. And this wine, this grape juice represents my blood spilled for you. Remember what our King has done for us. Thank you, Lord Jesus. Let's praise the Lord.
I want to go get cups.
Let's stand and worship some more.